Now, in a moment, we'll discuss the legacy of this case and what effect, if any, these verdicts will have. But first, let's hear reaction from some of those who knew Stephen Lawrence. Steve Smith spent a couple of hours earlier this evening in the London district of Eltham, where Stephen Lawrence was murdered.
Stephen Lawrence has been dead now for as many years as he lived. And so there are young adults in Eltham who've grown up with the knowledge of his murder always in front of them.
I'm going to be celebrating my 18th birthday next month, and it's a case that has been going on for like nearly 18 years now.
All your life, actually?
Yeah, before I was born. But I've always known about Stephen Lawrence, and I think it's a really significant time in history because today justice has been done, and it's been a long time coming, but today it's very important, I think.
I grew up with this whole stigma of it, you know, like I was about 11 at the time, but you still remember it. I still remember the day. I still remember it being on the news. And
how was it a stigma exactly?
Well, the things that are unsaid, you know, the whole racism thing. It was, and there was always things said to me from the outside, you know, like from different places, and
what sort of, you live in Eltham, that's where a lot of racists live, that kind of thing, or what?
Yeah, exactly, yeah, definitely. Like that was kind of said.
And is that true, do you think, or not?
Yeah, when I was growing up, absolutely, it was true, yeah.
While some were paying their respects, others, a few, took the opportunity to make comments from passing vehicles.
I think it's absolutely disgusting. I mean, whilst we've been standing here, there have been people calling out things, and
what have you heard?
You know, he deserved it. I heard.
Really? Somebody shouted that?
Yeah, as I think you turned around, I don't think you caught what they heard, but as they drove down, and I'm absolutely disgusted.
Met him when I was 7 in Sunday school. Went Blackheath Blue Coat together. Went college together. You know. He was honestly, he was a good guy, you know, and I know there's a lot of people hear it on the news and some people might get sick of it, but the truth is the truth, you know. He was a really cool guy.
Well, with us now are Lord Falconer, the former Lord Chancellor, Brian Paddick, a former senior officer in the Metropolitan Police, the London MP Diane Abbott, and we're joined from New York by the journalist Martin Bashir, who interviewed the Lawrence suspects in 1999. Brian Paddick, why were the Metropolitan Police so incompetent and so bigoted in those days?
It was a cultural thing. When I joined the police in 1976, racism was overt in the police service. People didn't think there was anything wrong in being racist. And what happened with the Stephen Lawrence murder investigation, it was not taken seriously enough. It was only the death of a young black man, and therefore the detectives did not treat the case seriously enough. They didn't devote the resources that should have been devoted to it. And as we just heard from Brian Cathcart, they did not use that opportunity to seize clothing, which could have led to the conviction of more people, even
bigotry that underpinned or explained the incompetence.
Well, what I think it was not valuing young black men's lives.
Now, the claim from the Metropolitan Police authorities now is that all that is gone, it's a huge change, and however much some people may dissent from that, the fact is there are two guys have been convicted for this crime now.
Well, first of all, let's not forget that there are a lot of other murderers walking free. It wasn't just two people that killed Stephen Lawrence. But what I would say is this: at the top of the Metropolitan Police, the senior police men and women you deal with are much more sophisticated and clever than the ones you dealt with 20 years ago. But I'm sorry to say, when you get further down the ranks, the old can-till culture has not gone away. And sadly, the experience of young black men on the streets of South East London, North London, Hackney is unfortunately all too similar to the experiences that Stephen Lawrence had.
So today isn't a watershed?
It's, you know, I know Doreen Lawrence quite well. I had close friends who supported her from the very beginning when this wasn't a fashionable cause. And I always remember her saying to me, you never expect to bury your child. And this is a watershed for her and Neville.
You presumably, Lord Falconer, feel vindicated in changing the law, at least?
Without the law being changed, one of the people convicted today wouldn't have been convicted, but it's a pretty minor aspect of the story. I think what happened to Stephen Lawrence indicated how racist we were as a society. And I think for the reasons that Diane is saying, and for the reasons that Brian is indicating, we still are in some respects. And if there hadn't been the campaigning of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence and the people who then supported them subsequently, because they were alone for a pretty long time, we would never have asked ourselves the questions as a society which led to the Lawrence report, which William Macpherson presided over, and threw a light on what Brian has just described. Because I think we might have thought in the mid-90s we weren't racist, and my goodness, what happened in the Lawrence inquiry, I mean the investigations the police didn't do, the period of time it took for us to realise what was happening was very, very striking. And that's why I don't think necessarily today is the watershed. It's what that light that Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence started shining on our society and on the police who represent our society. That's what the real watershed was being. I thought Mrs. Lawrence today, in saying that nothing can bring back for her either her son or those 18 years, and as Diane says, that 5 or 6 is the number of people who is thought to committed the murder. Cressida Dick said there are 9 people still being looked at. This is 18 or 19 years later.
Right. Martin Bashir, do you think justice has been done?
I do. The Prime Minister talks about wanting a big society, but essentially we need a just society, a society where, regardless of your background, your wealth, your colour, your origin, justice functions. And I think today that has happened. And that's a great thing for Britain. I think also, notwithstanding all of the criticisms of the police service, I think they do deserve credit following Macpherson. And just one point on that, Jeremy. Detective Chief Superintendent Clive Driscoll, who put this investigation together, it was such a formidable investigation that the defence didn't produce a single witness to challenge a single aspect of the key forensic evidence. And I think that is a remarkable achievement, not just because of the time that's passed, but also because it shows that the police service has learned something significant from what happened and the subsequent Macpherson report. And so, to answer your question directly, I do think that justice has been done. You know that I met all 5 of the so-called suspects over a prolonged period of time and met their parents. And it didn't take very long for me to realise why 26 separate sources within 24 hours of the tragic murder of this young man went to the police and named at least one of those 5 suspects as being responsible for that death.
It is staggering when you hear that and you just go back to what happened at the time. The evidence the police were given, it's astonishing that it's taken 18 years, isn't it?
It's a story of 2 halves here. As far as murder investigation is concerned, in terms of the way the police treat hate crime, where people are targeted because they're from a minority background, the fact that we now have family liaison officers, that murders are reviewed independently to make sure that the senior investigating officer isn't going down the wrong track, all of those changes have been fundamental, a direct result of the Lawrence murder, and all of those changes implemented even before Macpherson reported. But I agree with you, Diane, that where the police have failed to transform the way they operate is in terms of the encounters that they have on the street with young black men in London. You are still 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police in London if you are black than if you are white, and that cannot be right.
But just to say, one of the allegations that has always swirled around this case, the father of one of the defendants was a big gangland figure, and one of the allegations that always swirled around this case is corruption of the police by the father of one of the defendants. It's just an allegation. But let me just say one thing. There's been a very tragic murder in the last few weeks of a young Indian student in Salford who was killed in cold blood. It's allegedly been a hate crime. And all I can say is I only hope it doesn't take 18 years to find his killer.
Yes,
Jeremy,
well...
can I just offer you... Jeremy, can I just mention one thing
quickly,
that...
go on. Yes, Martin Bashir, go on.
Diane Abbott's just made the point about the police response. And I think that it's very, very easy to draw criticism and to attack the police for what has happened in relation to this case. I think, though, you have to come back to the facts that the police, subsequent to Macpherson, did not walk away from this case. They actually embraced the criticism of them and they've delivered a verdict to date. Now, that's never going to bring back the loss of Stephen Lawrence. And of course, all of us feel heartbroken for his family and convey our condolences to them. But let's not fail to give some credit where it's due here.
What happened was that they started a cold case review in 2007, and a man called Mr. Jarman, who is a private contractor, spotted the forensic stuff. All credit to the police for going on with it, but it took 8 years after Macpherson reported. And I don't blame the police for that, but basically having allowed all the forensics to go, you know that Macpherson has a list of criticisms, including watching black bin liners leaving one of the suspects' house with clothing. And that's why eventually what convicted these two people was a tiny speck of forensic evidence, which had they gone into the house within, say, 24 hours, Martin makes the point, they knew these people's names, they could have got search warrants, they could have gone in, they could have got gallons of forensic.
Does it strike you as odd, though, given you, I mean, you were part of this whole change in the law which made this possible, the abolition of the double jeopardy thing. Does it strike you as at all odd now that the only sentence these men can face is one that would have been applicable at the time the crime was committed, given how much more we now understand about racism?
Well, they are the crime, the sentence they're going to get is going to be based upon the fact, in part, that they were juveniles at the time that they did that. The principle there is if you commit a crime when you're a juvenile, you've got to be sentenced on that light. I mean,
sure,
I don't think
racial aggravation is clearly a factor in this case.
It's a matter for the judge to take into account the extent to which the racial factor would aggravate the sentence. That's for him to decide tomorrow.
But just to say this, I mean, all credit to the police, as Martin has been at pains to say. But again, I have to say, as a parent myself, all credit to the Lawrences, who, if they hadn't been... There were years when no one was interested in this case. Nobody was interested. If they hadn't been so persistent, they wouldn't even have got the partial justice they've got today.
And the price they've paid for this has been, and the way that they were treated, and that's why, although I don't in any way criticise the police for the 2007 review and what happened and the conviction that's now been obtained, but they felt completely isolated, and they felt that as victims they were treated appallingly by the police.
Martin Bashir.
The point that Diane Abbott makes about David Norris is well made. Clifford Norris, his father, is a career criminal who has spent time in jail. This young man grew up amidst endemic criminality. In fact, it was remarkable 2 weeks ago when he got into the witness box. He was so confident about his relationship, perhaps with his father, that spread into various police officers in the past, that he was able to say that he had an alibi in his mother on the night the murder took place, when actually, when I interviewed him, he told me that he was with his girlfriend Cheryl in her house. And I think that Diane makes a point that many of us have felt, which is that in the case of Norris specifically, there was some kind of discrete relationship between him, his father, and the Metropolitan Police. And nobody's disputing the existence of that and its effect on the inquiry.
And Brian Paddick, to bring it forward, this question of a changed relationship, didn't what we saw in the riots last summer actually indicate that there is still a very long way to go in repairing this relationship?
I think there is, and you know, Diane will probably know better than anybody as a local MP that tension between the police and the black community is still strained. And in fact, when my party leader Nick Clegg was delivering the Macpherson, the Scarman lecture in Brixton a few weeks ago, and I advised him to say that relations between the police and the black community were much better than they were in 1981. He was advised by the organisers not to say that, otherwise he would be seen to be out of touch with the local community. Now that is a very serious indictment of where we are in terms of police-community relations today.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Now, the business of choosing the most powerful